The scream tore from Sarah's throat, raw and desperate, echoing uselessly against a sudden, horrifying metallic shriek and the bone-jarring impact. "Say my baby." The words were a prayer, a command, a primal cry lost as icy water surged around her ankles, then her knees. Her world, just moments before filled with Lily's happy babbling and the mundane rhythm of a morning drive, had capsized into a nightmare of tilted trees, rushing water, and the terrifying, relentless rise of the creek. Lily, her precious 1-year-old, strapped in the back, was in mortal danger, and as the car groaned, sinking deeper, helped seem an impossible dream. But miles away, yet closer than she could ever imagine, a heart that had long forgotten how to beat for anything but sorrow was about to be violently reawakened by a past he thought he'd buried, and a future he never dared to hope for. An old man, haunted by his own ghosts, was about to become the most unexpected of heroes. Sarah usually found a fragile peace on this winding country road. It was her secret escape, a ribbon of asphalt that unspooled through sun-dappled woods and past fields dotted with sleepy, weathered farmhouses. It added 20 minutes to her commute to the little bakery where she frosted cakes and arranged pastries. Her part-time wages a lifeline in the precarious world of single motherhood. But those 20 minutes were hers, a quiet interlude before the cheerful chaos of Mrs. Gable's daycare and the demands of her shift. This morning had been particularly fraught. Lily, usually a sunbeam of a child, had been fussy, resisting her oatmeal, then wailing when her favorite stuffed giraffe, Jeffrey, had momentarily gone missing under a cushion. Sarah, running on too little sleep and too much coffee, had felt the familiar tendrils of exhaustion tightening around her. She'd found Jeffrey, kissed Lily's tear-stained cheek, and bundled her into the car seat, her heart aching with that potent mix of overwhelming love and gnawing anxiety that seemed to be the permanent soundtrack of her life since Mark had walked out, leaving behind nothing but a note and a gaping hole where their shared future was supposed to be. She glanced in the rear-view mirror. Lily was finally calm, chubby fingers clutching Jeffrey, her blue eyes, so like her own, fixed on the passing scenery. A small smile played on Lily's lips. Sarah's own heart eased. For Lily, she could face anything. For Lily, she built a world of small joys, singing off-key nursery rhymes, spontaneous kitchen floor dance parties, the nightly ritual of 3 bedtime stories. The little sedan, a hand-me-down from her older brother, might have seen better days, its engine sometimes sputtering in protest, but it was their chariot, their means of navigating the world together. Sarah dreamt of a small cottage with a garden, of Lily running freely, of a life where the bills didn't loom quite so menacingly. But for now, they had each other, and that, Sarah told herself fiercely, was everything. Further along that same creek, the one that snaked like a silver serpent through the landscape, lived Arthur Jenkins. His house, set back from the road and partially obscured by overgrown lilac bushes Martha had planted half a century ago, was a study in quiet decay. Paint peeled from the clapboard siding, and the porch swing hung by a single rusty chain, swaying mournfully in the breeze like a forgotten memory. Inside, dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the gloom of drawn curtains. Arthur himself was a fixture in this landscape of sorrow. 72 years had etched deep lines into his face, pathways of grief that started at the corners of his faded blue eyes and ran down his weathered cheeks. He moved slowly, his joints stiff, his shoulders perpetually stooped as if carrying an invisible weight. And, in a way, his days were a metronome of solitude. Tea, black and bitter, at precisely 6. An hour spent staring out the kitchen window at Miller's Creek, its waters a constant, murmuring reminder. Then a shuffle through the rooms, touching Martha's porcelain figurines, now coated in a fine layer of neglect, or running a hand over the worn velvet of her favorite armchair. He rarely ventured into town. The well-meaning, pitying glances of the older residents who remembered, and the oblivious chatter of the younger ones who didn't, were equally unbearable. His wife, Martha, had been gone for 15 years, her laughter and warmth slowly fading from the house like old perfume, leaving behind an aching void. But it was the loss of Emily, their bright, bubbly 5-year-old daughter, that had truly hollowed him out. 40 years. 40 years since the creek, in a cruel, swift moment of spring flood, had stolen her. He still heard her giggles in the rustle of leaves, saw her bright red boots in the flash of a cardinal's wing. The grief was a living entity, a companion he neither welcomed nor knew how to dismiss. He was, by all accounts, a man waiting for his own time to end, his heart a locked room, the key long lost. The sun was deceptively cheerful that morning, casting a warm glow on the world. Sarah, lulled by Lily's contented silence and the drone of the engine, allowed her mind to wander. She was mentally composing a shopping list, wondering if she could stretch her paycheck to include a new pair of shoes for Lily, whose tiny feet seemed to grow overnight. She rounded a familiar bend, one where the trees grew close to the road, casting deep shadows. And then it was there, a magnificent buck, antlers like a crown, stood frozen in the center of her lane, its eyes wide with a terror that mirrored her own in the next instant. Sarah gasped, her hands instinctively yanking the steering wheel. A primal scream lodged in her throat. The tires shrieked, a desperate sound against the asphalt. The car fishtailed wildly, the world outside the windshield a sickening blur of green and brown. She fought for control, but it was like wrestling a phantom. There was a horrifying lightness, a sense of disconnection from the earth, and then the violent, stomach-lurching drop. The front of the car slammed into the creek bank with a deafening crunch of metal and shattering glass, and then it plunged nose first into the shockingly cold water of Miller's Creek. Arthur was on his narrow porch, the one overlooking the creek, a chipped enamel mug of tea growing cold in his trembling hand. His gaze, as always, was fixed on the water, the patterns of light and shadow, the relentless flow. He didn't so much see the accident as feel it, a jarring disruption in morning's fragile peace, a flash of blue, an unnatural splash, the distant, ugly sound of impact. His breath caught, the mug slipped from his fingers, shattering on the weathered planks, the sound sharp and sudden in the stillness. For a beat, his mind refused to process it. Then, the image seared itself onto his vision. A car, tilted at a dangerous angle, rapidly succumbing to the greedy current. A wave of nausea, cold and debilitating, washed over him. Emily, the creek, her small, outstretched hand. The memory, always lurking just beneath the surface, erupted with volcanic force, paralyzing him. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a painful echo of a 40-year-old agony. He felt the familiar ice creep into his veins, the helplessness, the despair. It was happening again. The creek was claiming another. But then, a sound pierced the fog of his trauma, a sound more potent than any memory. A woman's scream, thin and reedy at first, then rising in pitch and volume, laced with pure, unadulterated terror. "Help me! My baby! Lily! Oh, God! Somebody, please!" The words were like shards of glass, slicing through Arthur's paralysis. A baby. Another child. The ice around his heart didn't just crack. It exploded. He was old, his body a roadmap of aches and pains. His knees were shot, his back a constant torment. But in that searing moment, the physical frailties were obliterated by a surge of something fierce and urgent, something he hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't thought. It was instinct, primal, protective. He moved. His legs, stiff from disuse, protested, but he ignored them. He launched himself off the porch, stumbling on the uneven ground, his ancient boots finding purchase on the damp earth. The embankment leading down to the creek was steep, treacherous with loose rocks and tangled roots. He slid, catching himself with a hand that scraped raw against a jagged stone, the sting barely registering. Sarah's cries were clearer now, a desperate counterpoint to the ominous gurgle of water engulfing the car. "I'm coming," he shouted, his voice a rusty croak, but carrying a surprising force. "Hold on." The creek water was a vicious shock, colder than he remembered, or perhaps he was simply less resilient now. It swirled around his ankles, then his knees, then his thighs, its current surprisingly strong, tugging at him, trying to pull his unsteady legs from under him. He could see Sarah clearly now. Her face was a mask of white terror, her dark hair plastered to her forehead. She was frantically wrestling with her driver's side door, but was clearly jammed against a muddy creek bed or submerged rock. The rear of the car, where the baby must be, was sinking faster, the water already halfway up the back window. "Get Lily!" she shrieked, her voice cracking, one hand pointing desperately toward the back seat. "Please, save my baby." Arthur fought his way through the churning water, his chest tight, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He reached the rear passenger door. It was mostly submerged, but the window was still, miraculously, above the waterline, though water was seeping in around the seals with alarming speed. He grabbed a handle, his gnarled fingers, stiff with age and cold, fumbling. It wouldn't yield. Panic, sharp and cold, threatened to overwhelm him. He saw Emily's face, small and frightened, in the murky reflections on the window. No, not again. He would not let this happen again. Summoning a strength he didn't know he possessed, a strength born of pure, desperate will, he threw his shoulder against the door. Once, twice, a third time, with a guttural cry torn from his own depths. With a tortured groan of bending metal, the door gave way a few crucial inches. He wedged his fingers into the gap and pulled, the cold water now soaking his chest, stealing his breath. Inside, the scene was one of chaotic terror. Lily was wailing, a high-pitched, terrified sound that clawed at Arthur's soul. Water was already pooling on the floor of the car, rising with sickening speed, nearly reaching the base of the car seat. Sarah was twisted around in her seat, straining against her seatbelt, her arm outstretched towards Lily, her knuckles white. "I can't reach her," she cried, her voice hoarse, her eyes wild with a mother's ultimate fear. "The buckle? I can't get the buckle." Arthur leaned further into the car, the frigid water now up to his own waist, the car groaning ominously beneath him. "It's all right, little one," he murmured, his voice surprisingly gentle, a tone he hadn't allowed himself to use in 40 years. "Grandpa's here." The word slipped out, unbidden, a ghost from a life he thought was irretrievably lost. He focused on the car seat buckle. It was a complex, modern contraption, unfamiliar to his old hands. His fingers, numb and shaking violently, fumbled with the release mechanism. Lily's cries were becoming weaker, interspersed with tiny, heartbreaking coughs. The water was lapping at the bottom of the car seat itself. Seconds. They only had seconds. "Please," Sarah begged, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the muddy creek water. "Please, hurry." She was looking at Arthur, then at Lily, then back at Arthur, her gaze a desperate, silent plea. He noticed a dark stain blooming on her forehead, just above her eyebrow, where she must have hit the steering wheel or the windshield. Her own safety seemed a distant concern to her. Arthur took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing a strange, almost preternatural calm over himself. He remembered something, a flash from an old first aid class he'd taken with Martha. Decade ago, something about pressure points on certain types of clasps. He pressed here, pulled there, twisted, and then with a small, decisive click, The harness released. Lily was free. He gathered the small, trembling child into his arms. She was so light, so terrifyingly fragile. Her wet hair was plastered to her forehead, her tiny body shivering uncontrollably against his soaked shirt. She looked up at him, her big, tear-filled blue eyes wide with confusion and fear. Then, blessedly, her cries softened to whimpers as she instinctively burrowed into the rough, damp wool of his old jacket, seeking warmth, seeking comfort. "I have her," he said, his voice strained but firm, turning his attention back to Sarah. "Now we get you out." But the water inside the car was now surging around Sarah's waist. As he spoke, the car gave a sudden, sickening lurch, settling deeper into the muddy creek bed, tilting further. "The door, it won't open anymore," Sarah choked out, her teeth chattering audibly. "And my leg, I think my leg is trapped under the dashboard." Arthur looked at the rapidly rising water, then at Sarah's pale, drawn face, then at the precious, shivering bundle in his arms. Lily needed to get out of the cold. Now. Hypothermia was a swift, silent killer in children. He knew he couldn't pull Sarah free himself. Not while holding Lily. Not with his own strength rapidly ebbing away in the icy water. He had to make a terrible choice, a brutal, split-second calculation of survival. Hold on to the door frame, he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument, his gaze locking with hers. "Keep your head up. I'm taking Lily to the bank. I'll be right back for you. Don't you dare let go. Do you hear me?" Sarah nodded, fresh tears carving paths through the grime on her cheeks. Her eyes, though filled with terror for her own predicament, held a universe of unspeakable gratitude as she watched him turn with her daughter. "Thank you," she whispered, the words almost lost in the gurgle of the encroaching water. "Just save her." Clutching Lily tightly against his chest, trying to shield her small body from the wind and the cold as best he could, Arthur began the agonizingly slow journey back to the embankment. The current seemed stronger now, or perhaps it was his own failing strength. Each step was an effort of will. His old knees screamed in protest. His lungs burned with every ragged breath. Lily had started to cough again, a harsh, rattling sound that sent fresh waves of adrenaline and fear through him. He had to get her warm. He had to get her safe. He thought of Emily, of the insidious coldness of the water that had stolen her from him. This time, he vowed this time he would not fail. This time, he would defy the creek that had haunted his nightmares for 4 decades. He finally reached the muddy bank, his legs trembling so violently he could barely stand. He sank to his knees, carefully laying Lily on a patch of damp grass, away from the immediate water's edge. With fumbling, numb fingers, he shrugged off his thick woolen jacket. It was soaked through, but it was all he had. He wrapped it around her tiny, shivering form, tucking it in as securely as he could. Her lips had a distinct bluish tinge. Stay warm, little bird," he panted, his gaze darting back to the car. Sarah was still there, her head and shoulders just above the waterline, but the car was noticeably lower, canted at an even more alarming angle. He had to go back. He had to try. But as he pushed himself up, preparing to re-enter the icy water, a new sound reached his ears, the distant, unmistakable wail of a siren. It grew louder, closer. Someone must have heard the crash in the road further up, or perhaps Sarah's desperate screams had carried further than he'd realized. He spared a precious second to look up the long, winding dirt driveway that led from a secluded house to the main road. Flashing red and blue lights were just visible through the trees, bouncing and weaving as a vehicle navigated the rough track. Help! Real help was on its way. "They're coming!" he yelled, cupping his hands around his mouth, his voice cracking with relief and exhaustion. "Hold on, Sarah. Just a little longer." He tried to take a step back toward the water, intending to offer what little support he could until they arrived. but his legs buckled completely. He collapsed onto the muddy bank, not far from Lily, his head bowed, gasping for air. He had done all he could. All his 72 years, all his accumulated grief, all his buried regret, had been poured into those few desperate, life-altering minutes. He was utterly spent. The paramedics were a blur of calm efficiency. Two of them, young, strong, and exuding competence, were in the water in moments, expertly assessing the situation around Sarah and the car. Arthur watched, his heart still pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, as they worked with practiced speed, using tools he couldn't aim to pry open the mangled driver's door and carefully extricate Sarah from the sinking vehicle. She was conscious, shivering violently, her face etched with pain and relief, but she was alive. Another paramedic, a woman with kind eyes, was already kneeling beside Lily, gently checking her vitals, her movements swift and reassuring as she wrapped the baby in a silver thermal blanket. Once Sarah was on the bank, her injured leg quickly and expertly stabilized by the paramedics, she pushed herself up on her elbows, her eyes, wide and frantic, searching. "Lily?" She croaked, her voice barely a whisper. Is she okay?" "She's cold and very scared, but she's a little fighter, ma'am," the paramedic tending to Lily said, her voice gentle but confident. "Her breathing is good. Her pulse is strong. Thanks to this gentleman here. You both got very, very lucky." She gestured with her chin towards Arthur, who was now slumped against the rough bark of an old oak tree, trying to catch his breath, the adrenaline ebbing away, leaving behind profound, bone-deep exhaustion and a strange, unfamiliar lightness in his chest. Sarah's gaze found Arthur, her eyes, wide and filled with an emotion too profound for words, gratitude, awe, a dawning, bewildered understanding, locked with his. He saw not just the relief of a mother whose child was safe, but something deeper, a connection forged in the crucible of shared terror and unexpected deliverance. The local sheriff, a man named Frank Henderson, who knew Arthur vaguely as the quiet, sorrowful old widower from Miller's Creek, approached him, his own face etched with concern and disbelief. "Arthur," he said, his voice hushed. "My God, man, are you all right? What you did, that was incredible." Sheriff Henderson had lived in the area his whole life. He knew Miller's Creek, knew its moods, its dangers. He also knew, as did some of the older folks in town, the whispered story of Emily Jenkins, Arthur's lost daughter. He looked at Arthur, then at the small silver blanket-wrapped baby being carefully carried towards a waiting ambulance, and a look of profound respect, mingled with a somber, poignant understanding, crossed his face. "You saved them both, Arthur," he said softly. "You truly did." Later that evening, the sterile quiet of the small county hospital was broken only by the soft beeping of monitors and the hushed footsteps of nurses. Sarah lay in a bed, her left leg elevated and encased in a temporary splint, a dull, throbbing ache, a constant reminder of the morning's horror. But the physical pain was dwarfed by an overwhelming sense of gratitude that brought tears to her eyes every few minutes. Lily, pronounced chill but otherwise unharmed after a thorough checkup, was asleep in a bassinet beside her bed, her tiny chest rising and falling in steady, peaceful rhythm. Jeffrey the giraffe tucked beside her, a kind-faced nurse, while checking Sarah's vitals, had quietly told her a little more about Mr. Jenkins, the old man from the house by the creek. She spoke of the decades-old tragedy, of his long reclusion, of how he'd lived with that profound sorrow for so many years, right beside the very body of water that had tried to claim her and her daughter. The image of the grumpy old man she'd occasionally glimpsed on her drives, a shadowy figure in a neglected yard, dissolved, replaced by the reality of a hero, a man who had stared into the face of his own deepest nightmare and found the courage to save strangers, the sheer, unadorned bravery of it. The quiet, unassuming heroism left her speechless, humbled. The next afternoon, against the advice of a two-tang nurse who thought she should rest more, Sarah, with Lily bundled securely in a borrowed infant carrier and herself leaning heavily on a pair of borrowed crutches, found herself standing on Arthur Jenkins's porch. The broken pieces of the teacup were gone, swept away, but the porch still felt like a place of quiet, enduring contemplation. She hesitated for a moment, then knocked softly on the faded blue door. It opened a few moments later, and Arthur stood there. He looked older in the clear light of day, his face deeply etched with fatigue, his clothes rumpled. But his eyes held a new light, a faint, hesitant flicker of something that hadn't been there before, something that softened the harsh lines of grief. He seemed genuinely surprised to see them. "Mr. Jenkins," Sarah began, her voice thick with unshed tears, her throat tight. There are no words. There are simply no words adequate to say. She paused, took a shaky breath. "You saved us. You saved my Lily." Tears finally welled in her eyes, spilling onto her cheeks, unchecked. "Thank you. From the very bottom of my heart, from the depths of my soul, thank you." Arthur looked at Lily, sleeping peacefully in the carrier, her tiny face serene, a miniature version of Sarah's. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his lips, a fleeting expression of something akin to wonder. "She's a beautiful child," he said, his voice still a little raspy, as if unaccustomed to speaking so much. He hesitated for a moment, then gestured awkwardly with a trembling hand towards the dim interior of his small, tidy living room. "Please," he said, "come in. If you're able, rest a while." Sarah carefully, awkwardly, navigated the doorway on her crutches. The house was filled with a faint, lingering sense of old books, lemon polish, and something else, something like dried lavender. It was quiet, meticulously neat, but not the oppressive, suffocating silence she might have imagined. It felt waiting. On a small, lace-covered table, nestled amongst a few faded, sepia-toned photographs, was a single ornate silver-framed picture of a little girl with bright, mischievous eyes, two neat pigtails tied with ribbons, and a gap-toothed smile. "Emily." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The resemblance to the faded photographs was unmistakable. Arthur, seeing where her gaze had settled, moved slowly to the table. He picked up the photograph, his gnarled fingers tracing the outline of the small, smiling face with infinite tenderness. This was my Emily," he said softly, his voice filled with a gentle, bittersweet sorrow, but notably not the raw, jagged pain Sarah had anticipated. "She loved this creek," he continued, his gaze distant for a moment. "Used to chase dragonflies along the bank, her laughter like wind chimes." He paused, then looked directly at Sarah, his eyes surprisingly clear, holding hers. "For 40 years, Sarah, every time I looked at that water, I saw her face. I heard her calling. Yesterday, when I pulled your Lily out for the first time in all those years, I saw a different child, a child I could reach, a child I could save." A single tear traced a slow path down his weathered cheek. He made no move to wipe it away. Sarah, deeply moved, reached out, her hand instinctively covering his where it rested on the silver frame. "She would be so proud of you, Mr. Jenkins," Sarah said, her own voice trembling with emotion. "So incredibly proud. What you did, it was more than just brave. It was the miracle. You gave my daughter back to me. You gave me back to her." As if on cue, Lily stirred in her carrier, letting out a soft, contented sigh. Her tiny hand, emerging from the edge of her blanket, uncurled, her miniature fingers stretching. Almost as if drawn by an invisible thread, Arthur reached out a hesitant, trembling finger. Lily's small fingers immediately curled around it, a surprisingly strong, instinctive grip. Arthur's breath hitched audibly, a look of profound, almost childlike wonder, of pure, unadulterated joy spread across his face, smoothing away years of ingrained sorrow, chasing the shadows from his eyes. It was such a small gesture, a baby's innocent, trusting touch. But for Arthur Jenkins, it felt like the sun breaking through after a lifetime of relentless storm clouds. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes shining with an emotion so potent it was almost tangible. Perhaps, he said, a genuine, faltering smile finally reaching his eyes, a smile that transformed his face. Perhaps the creek decided to give something back this time. In the weeks and months that followed, the quiet, winding country road by Miller's Creek became a pathway of unexpected connection, a bridge between two solitary lives. Sarah, once her leg had healed and she was back on her feet, made a point to visit Arthur regularly, Lily always in tow, often with a small offering of freshly baked scones from a bakery or a thermos of hot soup. The initial polite awkwardness between them soon faded, replaced by a comfortable, easy friendship that surprised them both. Lily, with the uncanny intuition of the very young for a kindred spirit, adored Arthur. Her delighted giggles and happy babbling soon became a familiar, cherished sound in his once silent house, chasing away the last of the lingering shadows, filling the rooms with a warmth they hadn't known in decades. She would sit contentedly on his lap, her small hands patting his cheeks as he read to her from old, well-loved storybooks. Emily's storybooks, their pages softened by time and countless turnings, his voice once rusty from disuse, gaining a new warmth and richness that Sarah found deeply comforting. He taught Lily how to identify the birds that visited his newly resurrected bird feeder, pointed out the funny shapes of clouds, and let her help him in the small vegetable patch he'd started to tend again, his movements still slow, but no longer burdened by the crushing weight of the past. Arthur Jenkins was no longer just a reclusive old man by the creek, a half-forgotten footnote in the town's collective memory. The story of the dramatic rescue, embellished with each retelling, had spread like wildfire through the small community. He was, somewhat to his own bemusement, hailed as a local hero. People who had once hurried past his neglected gate with averted eyes now stopped to offer a friendly word, a wave, an invitation for coffee. The town council even presented him with a small plaque for bravery, an event he endured with quiet dignity. Sarah and a beaming Lily by his side. But it was the transformation within him, the quiet blossoming of his spirit, that was the most profound. The heavy cloak of grief he had worn for so long, his only protection against the world, began to lift slowly, piece by piece, like morning mist burning off in the sun. He started tending his garden again, not with grim duty, but with a quiet, rediscovered joy, planting bright, cheerful flowers that Lily loved to touch with her curious fingers. He even, much to Sarah's surprise, accepted an invitation to the town's annual summer picnic, held in the park by the river. He sat on a checkered blanket with Sarah, sharing sandwiches and lemonade, Lily happily chasing a bright yellow butterfly nearby. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Arthur Jenkins laughed, a genuine, heartfelt sound that made Sarah's own heart swell. He became a grandfather to Lily in every way that mattered, filling a void in her life, and an even larger one in his own. He taught her how to skip stones on the now benign surface of Miller's Creek, his eyes holding not the ghost of yesterday, but the clear, bright reflection of a hopeful, unfolding future. Sarah, in turn, found in Arthur an unexpected pillar of strength and support, a wise, gentle, and reassuring presence in her often frazzled life as a young single mother. He watched Lily for an hour or two while Sarah ran errands or simply needed a moment to breathe, offering quiet, sensible advice only when asked, his very presence a steadying, calming balm. Sometimes, as Arthur sat on his porch, watching Lily play in his yard, her joyful shrieks echoing in the clear air, the same yard where Emily had once chased fireflies, a pang of the old sorrow would touch him, a faint echo. But it was different now. It was softer, gentler, mingled with profound, almost overwhelming gratitude. He had been given a second chance, not to erase the indelible pain of the past, but to embrace a new, unexpected present. A present filled with sticky fingerprints on his windows, the scent of baby powder, the warmth of a small hand tucked trustingly in his, and the astonishing, resilient, life-affirming power of human connection. The unexpected hero of Miller's Creek had not only saved a mother and her child from the cold, dark water, he had, in the most profound and beautiful way, saved himself. And in that quiet, overlooked corner of the world, by a creek that had once symbolized unbearable loss and unending grief, hope bloomed anew, vibrant and strong, a testament to the enduring, miraculous strength of the human spirit and the unexpected, life-altering ways kindness can ripple outwards, healing shattered hearts and forging new families from the precious fragments of the old.